Okay, so for the review, I'll call upon PM to open up this round of debate.
All right, 3, 2, 1. For years and years, Hollywood has locked in minority actors and communities into being solely portrayed in these realistic depictions. On Opening Government, we think that this is terrible and for the portrayal of racialized communities, and we think that it is far more accessible for people to watch horror films that portray these same issues. Firstly, what do these realistic depictions actually look like on their side? These are usually going to be films about the trauma that these communities endure. Things like slavery, things like the kind of civil, like the kind of like Jim Crow laws and stuff in the US. They dramatize these depictions severely because they want content that will draw the most amount of attention or the most amount of money. They exacerbate certain characters. So certain characters aren't actually portrayed entirely accurately. They are dramatized to the degree that people are going to watch these films. It takes away from the kind of realism that they actually want to attempt. Secondly, what do these horror films actually look like? On our side, we actually think that these horror films offer newer storylines. Why? Because they require intense amounts of creativity. They need to uniquely invoke fear. So it needs to show uncertainty for people. It needs to show different kinds of jump scares. You need to make a film from complete scratch rather than using a historical storyline that previously people might not have liked. Okay, why is the film portrayal of racial inequality important in this round? Two things here. Firstly, we think that it draws light to social issues that could have been previously ignored. So it's important for things like long-term relevance and progress towards social change. But secondly, we think that it just gives catharsis to these communities. So it makes people feel seen and heard. So communities that previously didn't have these issues discussed now actually can feel good when they watch this art and they feel seen. They feel like Hollywood genuinely cares about them. Why is realistic depiction then going to be bad for portraying racial inequality? Firstly, we think that they are often heavily scrutinized. So there's less people, and like just on the amount of realistic depictions that you can produce, there's less people that are going to want to do it in the first place because you get lots of backlash if there's a level of inaccuracy within it. But most people have a general idea of racial inequality, but they don't have a specific idea, and it's harder to do, and you need very accurate information about the situation to make these films well. Otherwise, you get severe amounts of backlash towards these films. So, for example, it's things like it's things like Green Book and stuff. If these films are portrayed poorly, lots of these same communities will not like these movies, and they will attack the actors and the artists who create these films, pushing them out. But secondly, these stories also often wash out these characters. They often have things like white savior arcs within these films, like in 12 Years a Slave, and generally in most of these realistic depictions that I know of, a lot of them have these white savior kind of characters, because in a lot of these cases with racialized inequality, this happened in the past 300 years, so it necessarily involves white characters oftentimes solving a lot of the problems who the racialized communities would genuinely actually face. So this takes away from the nuances or the actual realistic livelihood of the people that actually have gone through these things. Why is horror then better for people to feel seen and heard? Firstly, historically, racialized people were locked out of horror films. Why? Hollywood produced primarily new storylines that most people enjoyed. The problem is, during a time of racism, these movies often meant portraying solely white actors because audiences didn't want to see black people on screen. This meant that times have now changed. We have become far more progressive in regards to these racial issues in society. In the past, that's why you don't see that many horror movies with racialized communities, because they were just structurally locked out. It is important to now use this opportunity in a time of more progressivism to now have more racialized actors within these films. Why? Firstly, they're seen by a larger audience. Comparatively, fewer people watch things like Green Book. Why? Firstly, those movies with realistic depiction require great levels of intellectual curiosity. You probably need to know about the characters prior specifically. You probably need to know some specifics about, for example, in 12 Years a Slave, you probably need to know some specifics about American slavery and why it was so bad. These are important because I think that generally lots of people who don't live in the Western world can't relate or understand these topics uniquely well. People who lived in the Western world probably understood this to some degree, whereas these are not going to be nearly as accessible to people on the comparative. Comparatively, horror is going to be more universal. Why? People find it a lot more entertaining. You have far newer storylines, so you develop more characters that are more general, and people can relate to this better per the times, because people see these characters not as a slave, rather they can understand the like if they're watching like a horror, like in Get Out or something, they generally put themselves in this person's shoe. They genuinely see, okay, this person is similar to me, rather than, oh, this person, these communities went through significant amounts of trauma. On our side of the house, we can unlock these storylines for people that they previously were not able to access. Two, it invokes uncertainty, so it creates a relatability to the characters a lot more. Yeah. Okay, anyway, why do we do then better on the comparative? Firstly, on their side, racialized minorities are going to be continue to are locked into these stories of the past. So they are locked into portraying these realistic depictions rather than any sorts of new storyline, particularly in horror. Most people within these communities already know of these stories. They want more of these storylines, and particularly within these communities, they want to be seen in horror movies that they previously were not able to. We want to be, at least at minimum, we're able to give them the kind of catharsis that they were looking for that they weren't able to get in the past. I'll take the POI.
Like, this is a symptom of Hollywood being conservative in the past. In the past, racial inequality was not portrayed, period. Now that racial inequality is being portrayed, Black actors are being put front and center in both types of films in this debate.
The problem is not specifically the way racial inequality. Okay, the problem is on your side of the house, either way, people are going to probably know some amount of the problems of racial inequality because people teach this in schools. People have general discourse about this. People see it on social media, but it's not necessarily portrayed in these specific kinds of films that we think that a lot of these communities generally actually want. Why is this important? Firstly, realistic depictions, regardless of having more information, are not portrayed well in the media. On our side, we enhance the likelihood of these social issues actually being discussed because they are far more accessible. So lots more people can actually interact with these movies in a more meaningful way, where they can actually feel like they understand these issues rather than feeling like, these films are, specifically made for an audience that they can't really relate to. But secondly, we make this discourse accessible for people outside just the Western world. So because it's so much more accessible, people outside the Western world can now understand these issues a lot better as well. So previously, if you didn't know things about slavery, you can now probably understand more about the specifics of these issues. The last thing is that I think on their side of the house, the kinds of movies that you're going to get, like we said, are just generally quite worse. And the reason is because corporations have a unique incentive to make these films a lot more dramatized, but then also wash out specific characters to meet to the lowest common denominator of the kinds of people that they would like to reach. This happens on either side of the house. We would rather this happen with horror films where people can see these storylines in a horror level rather than on their side of the house where you take real actual stories that people genuinely face and you take them in a way and you make them Hollywood related. And I think that this is genuinely just bad for these communities. This takes away from the actual realism that these stories are likely wanting to portray. With that said,
Brilliant, thank you. Remarks from Bon Ello, this is the debate here.
The most unflattering angle.
Yeah, handwriting is so pretty.
Thank you. Like a list of people. Sorry. Can I start? Okay. I'll begin with knocking OG out of the round and engaging on attention the way they want us to, because I think that they're actually losing this attention clash in a number of ways. The first is that when you dramatize the harms, there's a few things that happen to the oppressors involved. The first thing is that you paint them as paint the actual, I think, bad things that are happening as radical. So you move the goalpost of what seems to be a problem in the first place. It is not perhaps the fact that you're avoided in certain social situations. It's not the fact that you're not afforded the same type of treatment from the government. No, it's a more extreme type of violence that the vast majority of the oppressors cannot necessarily relate with themselves. So perhaps you get more attention in these views, but it's not realistic attention, which means they learn very little from this. But for other oppressors, I think it's easy for these types of dramas who, perhaps in some way, they're just kind of asserting that some particular oppressive group is responsible for doing a lot of bad things. Therefore, I think it gets less engagement, because it seems like OG's point is just when you depict it too realistically, the oppressors feel really bad that they did these things and therefore don't want to watch the media, which means you either aren't showing that they did it badly enough, or you're showing unrealistically bad things that they also wouldn't relate with, or you're doing it just as badly as with us, so you're not getting any attention. So yeah, I do think that attention largely is more dependent on things like whether the media is good in the first place anyway. So we're either winning this clash or it is marginal to begin with.
I think the stuff about white saviors is also just as symmetric. It can happen in horror films too. And also, I think that OG concedes that these depictions are changed on the basis of relatability, right? So their entire point was you'll change the way that slavery was depicted to make it more relatable to the white people who currently exist. If you say this means that you're changing the way slavery is depicted, which I think is bad. Okay, let's talk about our core case, which is that realistic depictions are more validating. I'm going to weigh this at the end of this argument. The first thing I want to point out is that drama does two things. Number one, I think it substitutes the struggles and racism that a lot of these, I think, minorities have to experience. And the reason for this is what OG says, in order to create relatability and to garner attention across a broad audience, as opposed to painting things realistically. And the second thing is, I don't think it comes to the correct interaction. And so I think that the entire point of horror is that it is supernatural, and as I said earlier, moves the goalpost of what is problematized. But I also think that you lose a lot of intersectionality across this discussion, right? So no, thank you. Later. So I think that, like, largely speaking, you have probably blanket terms that generalize the experiences of an entire minority in order to, like, create this us and them type of perspective that would exist within a horror that has other focuses, as OG points out, being like fear and tension, as opposed to talking about the specific character like building and nuances. So, like, perhaps the same beast is just as harmful to mom and dad at the same time, but the point is dad has an income and dad has very different struggles throughout life as mom, and so I do not think that these experiences can be equated with each other. So I just think you lose a lot of nuance on their side of the house because of these reasons. Why are our realistic depictions are going to be good? The first thing is just, if both sides are being done by Hollywood, then all of these things are also just, I think, comparative. So we're comparatively better than them. But the other thing is, I think that a lot of the realistic depictions we're talking about, as OG also points out, are like real historical events. And we're more likely to get it to be these real events, not necessarily even like significant historical events, but just events that the author themselves have experienced if they're trying to depict something that is realistic. Horror is far easier, or at least it is far more possible to, I think, edge into the side of fiction in order to create something, as opposed to, I think, realism that kind of relies on you being grounded in some sort of a true story. And that's probably also where the best realistic media comes from, right? Like some interpretation of real life that, like, where you can draw on the best versions of how things happen. So here's why this is way better for us then. Like, Wynn's illustration is that, like, Muslims in Singapore are called lazy. My illustration is that Claire recently wrote a paper on like migrant workers, and I don't know if like the specific word for it, but in Lebanon, the word they use for maid just literally means Sri Lankan. So sometimes you'll hear kids asking other people, "Is your Sri Lankan a Sri Lankan?" And I think this is absolutely crazy, and this is probably the type of, like, the nuances that you want to be able to have across a lot of this media that just obviously wouldn't be included within horror, right? These are the types of interactions that I think, like, are the everyday, I think, observations you get from a lot of these minorities that are lost from horror when you're too focused on the blanket depictions that perhaps do not care that there's a particular maid character who has a specific interaction that belongs to them compared to everybody else. The second thing, though, is that validation is just incredibly rare to begin with. Nobody is willing to, I think, for these minorities, right? So the oppressors gaslight their victims to internalize that these problems happen in the first place. And so I think a lot of these victims internalize that, perhaps, like, Muslims are just rare, or like Chinese people just can't drive or some shit, right? So, like, perhaps I think the better case for us is that validation becomes something that matters a lot to these types of communities, which means because these stories are real, they represent the interactions you had with your friends, your family, and also your oppressors. These then also become a shareable piece of media that is relevant to everybody within your community. Horror is not shareable in this way. So even if they have an off case where this horror is really relevant to one kid who, like, really resonates with that character, it's not something that can become the fabric behind the community in the first place. And I think that's why validation matters so much, right? Because not only do I think it's, like, just a right to be understood and heard, which I think minorities often aren't, which is why we should prioritize media that seeks to understand these problems as opposed to, like, creating attention or buzz around their identity to eventually become, like, I think, corporate washed into another political issue. Like, I think it's much more important as to create, like, these opportunities for them to be heard in the first place. And it's an anthem that I think keeps the movement, like, continuing to go, right? Like, it's messaging that serves to keep the community together and understand that they're fighting for the same goals. And without these types of art as a fundamental, like, basis for this movement, it's impossible. Yeah.
Do you think that minorities are unable to suspend disbelief? I think most people watch movies and they, even if it's not them being represented, they're able to still feel emotions and understand the message behind it.
No, I'm sure they can suspend disbelief, but the problem is, like, it's not about whether or not they believe the media or not, because obviously they don't believe the fucking horror. The question is, like, whether or not the horror is, like, talking about the issues at all. And, like, maybe you're just forced to defend this because OG concedes this, but on your side, you're fundamentally making this media for people who are not of the skin color that is being oppressed, who are minorities that are like that have real experiences that would not translate well towards the mass market, and is especially bad in translating into horror, especially since horror is like, at the very least, Hollywood horror is a very, very, I think, white central, like centrist type of media that forwards a lot of, I think, cliches that specifically exist within that genre. So it's very difficult to do this type of translation and still maintain a lot of the nuances that are specific to like racial inequality. So I guess on that note, like it's not that they can't suspend disbelief, but even if they suspended disbelief, the message is just white people bad, which is not a validation. It is just like a presentation of something that, like, yeah, I guess this is a piece of trauma you experience in your life, but it's not meaningful in the same way that our things can become fundamental to your community. Like in the same way, like I think I don't know, like how whiplash maybe becomes like a thing about like musicians practicing. Like this becomes something that you come to reference across time to understand the struggles that you face and your community get along better. Thank you.
I consent to recording now. I might revoke it later. Three, two, one. Raymond says that on our side, horror movies don't understand, or minorities are unable to understand racialized people. I think this is insane. I want you to imagine, Hale, that you are a Black person and you are walking at night and you see a cop, for example, or you see a group of white people. For them, this is a horror movie. This is the experience of that primal fear where you feel that you may just die now, or when you're a mother and you get a call from the police or whatever about your son. Often this is often a substantially primal experience these people face in the first place. One unique or like 2 points here. First, why is the actual impact of horror, the emotion of horror that we produce, fundamentally much more both impactful to even people who are not minorities, but also much more impactful to minorities themselves? And second, why is their side much more likely to be patronizing, as per Hamza A's analysis? First, why is the emotion of horror here uniquely impactful? First, two minorities especially here. First, because it is more accurate to their day-to-day on the emotional level. I want to be clear here. The problem on ops side is that often it is the specific trappings in these movies of racial equality that are being shown, but it's not the actual emotion that is being inflicted. Often the biggest thing that these people face when they are often in these situations is not in fact the experience of someone looking out from the outside in on seeing like the realism of racial equality. It is the horror they feel when they feel like their life itself might be put at substantial risk, and when they feel like they might actually die in the first place. This is incredibly universal among these people, among a lot of like minorities who do feel like this substantial fear on a daily basis. The second reason is novelty bias. Often we understand things and we're able to internalize things much more insofar as these things are somewhat new or changed in a substantial way. This is why, for example, a lot of people actually did gravitate to films like Get Out or Get Out or Sinners, for example. It was the fact that they were removed from the mundane into the fantastical that made these films uniquely easy to internalize. Often especially if you're talking about a marginalized person, when we feel like when we are depicted with realistic horror depictions or realistic depictions of racism, the problem is that these are these people's lives in the first place. They already go through this. They already go through these trappings substantially. So the issue becomes is that often, even if they see this movie and they understand on a surface level this is similar, they do not actually inspire them to feel nearly as strongly because this is fundamentally similar to them. What makes these films stick out is, in fact, the fantastical elements that these horror films take place in, the very powerful emotions that they face. That's the third reason, by the way. It's the emotion, basically the emotion bias. Horror is, as an emotion, which is what primarily these films inspire, is one of the most powerful emotions people feel. It's also the most universal, and this makes it uniquely applicable to people who are not these marginalized people, and actually means it's much easier for these people to relate to these films as well. The reason why is because it is the most primal and powerful feeling we have is the fear of death and the fear that we might die. This is evolutionarily ingrained into our psyches in the first place. This means that the actual emotion itself makes us substantially internalize these films much more. It makes us feel much more powerfully and therefore remember the actual film in the first place, and it makes us feel more seen. For people who aren't marginalized, it makes insofar as they're much more captivated by that film and it sticks out in their mind more, they're much more able to understand and relate to those people because they feel the emotions that that person felt. They understand what it's like to be that person, and then when they feel much more willing to, if you buy these social classes relevant, much more likely to support these issues in the first place. No, I want you to couple this with Hamza's analysis. This is, for example, when you get much more buy-in in the first place because you do not see these as an intellectual exercise. On opposition, the problem is that the comparative is much more sterile, or often the emotion that this is trying to get you to feel is something along the lines of pity, and there's a pity or like sadness on this. Like literally look at the Green Book. But the big reason this is true is because often the intended audience of racially realistic films is not going to be marginalized people. It's going to be white people. The reason why this is true is because often marginalized people know what it's like. I do not. If you're marginalized, you do not need a film that depicts you what a racially realistic depiction of life, because you understand what you don't need a film that is accurate to the depiction of racial inequality, because you already live this. You live this depiction of racial inequality in the first place, and so it's not particularly compelling to you. You don't get much by this. The people who these films are made for are white people who do not actually understand what that's like in the first place. So this tends to mean the intended audience itself is white people, and inspiring pity in them to understand what these people go through or whatever, or the realistic trappings. The problem is that now this makes these films much less understandable and enjoyable to the people who actually fucking have to live those experiences. Horror, by contrast, is much more appealing to these people because the actual function of the film is basically to show you the horror of what that person experiences on a day-to-day basis. What is being depicted is not for the other person to understand and pity. It's for the marginalized person to relate to the film and see the horror that this person faces and understand it in themselves and gain some amount of catharsis because they don't understand what it's like to live, what it's like there. I want to now. Sorry. Actually, yeah. Wait. No. I wanted to talk this. Look. First, I want to engage with what opening opposition says here. Opening opposition tries discussing like how they want to maybe get more people like on board or whatever. Or there's stuff about like maybe white people are going to be upset because they're depicted as a bad guy. First, I want to fight. I do think white people are depicted as a bad guy at points in their films, anyways. So I don't know if their racially realistic depiction has like a slave owner or whatever. All of a sudden, those white. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So I'm not sure what emotion you're trying to encapsulate. It seems like people generally understand that racism exists and it is a bad thing to feel when people are being racist to you. So you're just missing all the nuances when you generalize.
No, the problem is that the emotion of horror is much stronger than the emotion of pity, because you can forget the emotion of pity, but the emotion of horror speaks to you potentially losing your own life. Awesome. Look, opposition tries saying, oh, white people are going to feel like upset. Or upset when they're against a bad guy. First, slave owners exist on their side anyways. I'm not sure why this is comparative, or there's slave owners in these movies, and some of those are the bad guys too, so I'm not sure why the same people would not be upset there. But second, it is for these people to actually gain any benefit. It is logically prior for them to actually be engaged with the film at all. I need to understand, need to want to be engaged, and I need this film to stick with me in the first place, which is where horror actually comes in. So even if you buy any of their analysis, we're already logically prior here. Finally, I want to talk about Wen's POI. Like, bro, if Hollywood is liberal, this is symmetric on both sides and in comparative anyways, and we're still winning anyways because this is how the mode of the film actually interacts with these people. Even if it's done incredibly poorly or incredibly well, I think we're still winning on fight. Horror is just de facto more powerful, and we're able to both inspire. If you actually make marginalized people from the scene and the alternative, try to propose.
Really, and thank the speaker for their remarks. Call upon the DLO to continue this debate.
I might move some of your stuff. I have a lot of paper. The trees were already dead.
I was trying. Oh, I was about to stay at 86. It's too locked in.
I'll talk about validation, which is the easiest and most certain way for opening opposition to win this debate, and then I'll talk about education. Let's start with validation. The problem in this debate is that many victims of oppression lack the validation of the racial inequality that they face on a day-to-day basis. This might seem like a bizarre and unintuitive premise to you, but this is the lived reality of many Asian immigrants in the US, is the lived reality of many women in Latin America, in many places in the third world. In these areas, these individuals are often taught and are often told that they're deserving and not like they're deserving not deserving of respect. They're often played into stereotypes, things like the lazy Malay stereotype, like individuals telling that they're not getting, being told that they're not getting things because they're not working hard enough, or women who are told that they are not assertive or not confident enough, who are gaslit into believing that they are the reasons why they are oppressed. In these areas, these attitudes and stereotypes are often socialized and internalized from a young age, from how you're treated by your teachers, from how your parents behave, from the attitudes that these individuals tell you, which leads to self-blame. It means that narratives often tell these individuals that the inequality is their fault, that this kind of oppression is their fault. Why is this validating? Firstly, it is incredibly relatable. These people are watching for the first time on these movie screens, people who look like them, who live similar lives, face the exact same problems that they do. And when they do so, they see like a genuine outpouring of empathy online about other individuals who step up, who say, I also experienced this, I also face these kinds of problems, and that is a powerful moment. Secondly, it's important because of the framing of these victims. These individuals are often sympathetic on these films. They have emotional stories, like, for example, losing your job because of discriminatory hiring. For example, how hard it is to feed your children and make ends meet in America, for example. These are compelling stories that people want to watch. Thirdly, this is good for producers. Often these are the individuals who face these obstacles in life, who wanted to bring these stories to life. And this is an emotionally cathartic experience for those individuals as well. But lastly, this is important because of the resolution at the end of the story. It is not just about oppression, it's about overcoming the oppression and portraying it in a realistic way. These small steps that these individuals take to improve their lives and the lives of those individuals around them, that is a powerful moment. Often minorities vicariously experience this form of happiness. It allows them to imagine a world in which they are no longer bothered by these kinds of experiences. It allows them to imagine a roadmap towards that happiness, and that kind of optimism is something that these individuals need. So when this team says that these individuals need to feel afraid and they need to feel horror, that is not what these individuals want. They are tired of being afraid. They want a world in which the experiences that they face on a day-to-day basis are validated by film. And this is something that is uniquely only possible by film, because when you see people talk about the next zeitgeist online, when you see many individuals in the comment thread talking about the experiences that they share that you relate towards, and when you see this movie do well at the box office, you feel like this is a symbol of your oppression. You feel like this is something that is important to you, and that is something that gives you a great deal of personal responsibility. So at the end of this first argument, you should just believe on vulnerability and just on scale. This is a incredibly important emotional benefit for these individuals that massively uplifts your lives. Second clash. Let's talk about education. The first question I want to ask under this is, will people watch these films? The first thing I'll establish is why these films are likely to be done well, and why is the case that this is going to be incredibly popular. I'm missing my paper on this. I found it. Okay, why is this likely to be done well? Firstly, this is often done, written, directed, and promoted by minorities who have these lived experiences and are very well equipped to set this in the real world. This is far harder under that side of the house, when they need to translate and metaphorize their experiences and change it into something supernatural, something that individuals find far harder to understand, which creates a difficulty for individuals to be able to relate to that film under that side of the house. Secondly, there's often a backlash if it is bad. If you're racist, you are cancelled, you make less money, you have financial incentives to not do this, and you have strong reputational harms that incur upon you at the point in time in which you do this in incredibly bad ways, especially in the modern day, which I think is the most reasonable assumption in which this debate is taking place, because Hollywood would have been bigoted in like the 1900s anyways. Lastly, I would just note that this is a race to the top, and often there's a competition on realism. So when this team says that you compete to be more dramatized and you compete to be more sensational, maybe that was true when these films were initially being produced, but in the modern day, individuals care a lot more about nuance. They care a lot more about intersectionality. And the reason why that's the case is twofold. Firstly, if everyone is sensationalizing it, this becomes like a very crowded market. Individuals are looking to diversify. They're looking to find their niche. That's the reason why you talk about more diverse forms of inequality, more diverse forms of individuals, in order for you to distinguish your story and make this more powerful. But secondly, I would just note that often individuals care a lot more about these things being realistic. You often get your film called out online, or you're being told that these kinds of things are unrealistic. See, for example, a great deal of LGBT films and the way in which those individuals are portrayed in very very typical stereotypes that received a lot of hate from the LGBTQ community. That's further reasons why it's likely the case that people will watch these films. Secondly, these films can still be interesting. When opening garment says that these black individuals often feel a primal fear when you're walking around at night and you get flagged down by a policeman, we can translate these experiences to film without even needing to resort to the supernatural. When you see the glances that the police have, when you see their hands twitch towards the gun, when the music reaches a crescendo, that is the moment in which the audience feels a very strong visceral fear, and they feel a strong connection with this individual who is an ordinary individual walking around the ordinary mundane life that everyone is living. They face horrors and face evil to the extent to which this movie explains. But lastly, I would just note that this allows us to increase the spectrum of films that exist within the world. What this government team needs to defend is only extreme films, only supernatural, only incredibly metaphorized forms of evil and forms of like racial inequality, whereas we can portray far more mundane forms of inequality in ways that are more important. Closing.
Do you think that the average experience of inequality is mostly like physical or direct pieces of racism, or the emotional inner experience of racism?
It's both. We can also appeal to both. Second question, will these films be educational? We think ours will be more educational for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's more nuanced. It allows for things like intersectionality. It allows for us to diversify. But I would also note that it's more like there's also better prioritization. Things like attention and time are scarce resources. You need money, you need budgets, you need screen time. Under that side of the house, you spend a lot of time on unnecessary things like the supernatural details, things like action scenes, for example, to keep the supernatural plot going. Secondly, it's far harder for you to write the stories under that side of the house because you're telling two stories at once. The story that individuals are experiencing within the film and the metaphor that you're trying to link back towards real life, it's far harder for you to execute that kind of thing. And it often leads to things being very heavy-handed. For example, white people being possessed to be racist. When you see their eyes roll up, you see the whites of their eyes, when you see that justification for why they act badly towards black people, for example, that is something that's very hard to relate to individuals. But lastly, it's far more realistic the ways in which we portray this. What is the impact of this? We're not saying that people change their behaviors overnight. We're not saying that racist white people will change their behaviors. What we're saying is that people in the middle are more likely to change. When you see a trauma plot about the patriarchy and harassment, you're more likely to stop your mate when they catcall and harass a woman at a bar. When you see a plot about how hard it is to make ends meet in America, you're more likely to hire that black individual. And so those small behavioral changes meaningfully over a long period of time increase the livelihoods of individuals.
I'm gonna sit down for this.
Make it better and focus.
Okay, whoever that is loud as fuck. Okay. Last time I watched a horror movie was the Winnie the Pooh horror movie. I have no idea what the fuck that was supposed to represent, and to this day I still don't. So if CG wants to explain that to me, like, please go ahead. There are a few prerequisites to understanding a message and internalizing it and changing your behavior. The content has to be made. People have to be aware of its existence and actively choose to view it. The people have to have the tools necessary to interpret the messaging. And then lastly, the message has to be strong enough to resonate. I'm going to go through this checklist and tell you why horror is just inadequate in all 5 of these metrics. On our side, we just get a larger impact on those who could be and are sympathetic to the plight, but do not yet understand. We give them the tools and the ability to understand. Firstly, there's less content made on their side. Racial narratives are versatile and already in the mainstream consciousness and have been for a while. They're easier to adapt, and it is far easier to convey messaging in a way that is clearly understandable when it is parallel to another kind of plot. Listen, I watched Zootopia 2. I know that's an animated movie, but they did a great job of showing how one set of reptiles or whatever had their land taken away because of narratives against them that portrayed them as dangerous when that wasn't true. Yeah, they're animated, but this is literally what's happening in Israel. We had Everything Everywhere All at Once, where there was a plot about a mother-daughter relationship, but they also showed the immigrant experience and the discrimination that happens with people talking down to you in a way that was incredibly significant and poignant. These narratives are things that can exist parallel with other kinds of things, and so more if it becomes possible, because the movie does not just have to be about racial narratives, it can be about racial narratives, and that's what makes it so much more versatile on our side and can be included in many more things. The second thing is a horror just has a much smaller reach because it cannot do this, right? Firstly, many people do not enjoy being afraid. You have an overactive imagination, and you imagine being chased by a monster, and that's really fucking freaky to you, so you avoid that content. You have people have negative emotions from having to be a wage slave at work or having to fucking sit in a debate room for a million hours. You want to pick something that's positive to you, and if horror doesn't give you that, you're going to pick something else. The third is just that like people treat other movies like far more holistically. They can pick something that's more relatable to them and act on their preferences. But lastly, there's just more reluctancy to make this content for studios, right? Horror movies generally have one or two central things that produce the horror. So like one stalker, one monster, and you have to make a massive decision to focus that horror and choose to make that metaphor about racial equality. It has to be good because of the production cost. It has to be done well, and so the risk is often too high to actually justify making that content. So that means on our side, we get more content. The probability of someone choosing to watch a movie and being aware of its existence and its messaging is far higher on our side of the house. The second criteria is that you have to choose to view it. And there's an attention economy where many things are competing for people's attention at the same time. When you're scrolling Netflix, you get a wide array of movies, and you often pick which one to watch based on a 3-second evaluation of what like the blurb tells you, right? Or at the bookstore, I guess like books are kind of like part of this debate as well. But the thing is, on our side, there's far more appeal because it is more adaptable. If I like romance movies, I can choose to watch a romance movie that just so happens to have a narrative about like a discrimination in it. If I like, I don't know, fucking like kids movies, I can do that. But it means that people are more willing to see the messaging because it is part of a larger piece of content that they're more likely to enjoy. They're more likely to make that selection, even if they're not as interested in this kind of messaging, but they are more so into the summers of Plot the Bug. So it means that the probability of them choosing it is so much higher. But it also means that you can show it to your friends. You don't. It's kind of like wacky to be like, yeah, I really like this like movie because it really made me feel things about my race. You can be like, no, this movie had a great plot and this character made me feel really seen. And so because of the fact that it can exist parallel, it means that if people are far more able to choose to be able to view it. Go ahead, Hamza.
Yeah, so if this is an attention economy and your content is supposed to be more educational and our content
I
is
know what? Okay. Literally, it does not have to be educational, like whatever. The third criteria is that people must have the tools necessary to actually be able to interpret this. The first thing is that many people have not proximately experienced racial discrimination. So you can visualize what discrimination might look like, but you cannot actually see or feel the impacts on someone. You cannot feel those emotions. The problem is that even if this is kind of true symmetrically, you need far more tools to interpret horror. Not only do you need to be able to kind of recognize like those emotions that you don't feel, you have to actively think about the metaphor and what the monster represents in it. You have to have some baseline understanding of the racial experience to actually be able to draw the parallels. But the problem is that many people don't have a great understanding because they've never experienced that kind of discrimination in their life. They don't recognize that there is even an alternative point of view that the horror could be about. For example, when we had Alien and like the fucking chest bursters or whatever, that was a great metaphor about body horror and how like you have unwanted heat in your body for lots of women. That was fantastic. Many men did not realize that was what the movie was about because they've never experienced that kind of body horror in their life. And so as a result, on their side of the house, many people are never able to bypass the barrier because they just do not aware that these other experiences are things that exist. The last criteria is that the messaging has to be strong and accessible enough, and this is better on our side of the house. The problem on their side is people remember the horror, but they do not remember the messaging. You've experienced that fear when you lie in bed, but it is harder to visualize yourself past just being chased by the monster. It's hard to imagine yourself in this position that the metaphor is supposed to represent and not just, I don't know, like fucking running away from Winnie the Pooh in the woods or whatever. So, for example, I watched It Follows, great movie, by the way, which is about, like, it represents, like, like an STD or whatever. I saw the movie. I'm afraid of that fucking monster chasing me, but I'm not afraid of, like, getting an STD. Like, I just, like, it's not nearly as, like, scary as that. The fear of the actual monster is far more intense than the fear of the metaphor. And so the fantastical element of horror movies does not become the medium. It actually becomes an inhibition to the medium and a prevention from the metaphor to spread. But there's also a problem because there's a correlation between how good the movie is and like how like little people kind of like remember that, right? Like the better the metaphor is, like the scarier the monster is, it means that the better the element of horror has to be to convey it, which further distracts attention from the messaging. And so people end up talking about how good the actors were or the visual effects, but not what the metaphor is supposed to be. And so that is what people remember, have as their takeaway. I'm not taking you. OG says like a message needs to stick with you. Horror does that, but the messaging isn't what sticks. It's the monster and that immediate fear and not the metaphor itself. The last thing on our side is just that seeing injustice resonates far more strongly regardless of whatever parallel plot exists. It's more proximate. Even if people have not experienced racial discrimination, they have experienced injustice. They have felt pity or empathy for those in worse positions than them. It is far more possible to imagine yourself to be in that position where someone is unfairly like talking down to you or denying you opportunities, and you feel that injustice and you remember it when you see this realistic depiction in front of you. You see the emotions on their face, you hear their voice sounding less confident, and this is something that tugs at your emotions, and that's what you remember. And you are more aware of what it looks like because you have seen that directly on the big screen. You realize that you can see the parallels directly in real life because you've seen what it's like on the screen. So you can, I don't know, like you can see your coworker being treated poorly by those around them. You can the feelings of injustice rise when that kind of happens, or you can see people making those ignorant comments. And the behavioral change is what happens here. And you become more sympathetic to like people experiencing this because like more like know what it's like now. So when people see this en masse in mainstream media, this scales up even if the like immediate impact is small, right? Like children see this and know that they shouldn't just randomly treat their their peers differently because someone on the TV told them to. You no longer get annoyed when people tell you to vote for candidates that are against racism. These things stack over time, and as they do, and as these messages get more and more perpetuated in accessible mainstream media, this is at the point at which people actually feel a difference in their day-to-day lives. We oppose.
Brilliant. I thank the speaker for your remarks and all around we got with. We listen to you. Thank you.
Can you fill my bottle, Liam?
Oh, I'm running to the washroom. I'm sorry. That's my turn.
Ready? Okay. Am I audible on the Zoom?
Yes.
Okay, great. The entire opposition bench wants to claim behavioral changes on how people are going to treat minorities. But the issue here is it never proved to you why people are likely to opt in to watch these realistic depictions of racism in the first place, right? I think Humam already gives you analysis on why this is content that you're seeing everywhere else. You get this in history textbooks. You see this exposure, like even in the entertainment industry for decades nowadays, right? It is unclear to me why people are then, especially like a white privileged person, is likely to be like, oh, I want to learn about the Black person's experience for the 10th time in a row and go to the theater and watch these kind of movies. I don't think they're able to fully reach their impact, and I'll prove to you why in my speech. Okay, the speech is going to be relatively simple then. I think I'm going to do first rebut CO, then OO, then weigh against our front half, why we should win. So I think CEO outlines you some pretty good reasons as to like how you get to internalizing lessons for movies, but unfortunately, I think this actually works against them. First, they want to talk about like awareness, people like learning about it, and etc. And I would like to know, like, it's unclear to me why their side of the house likely to have better budgets from Hollywood, better advertising from Hollywood, right? I think like intuition from this, like a lot of people enjoy horror movies. Horror movies tend to do very well in the box office. They probably do way better in the box office than any kind of racial movies specifically. So it's unclear to me why they get all of the access and advertising benefits that they claim they do get. But second, they say that there's just like less content being made. They just assert that people don't really like horror movies. Like I don't think empirically this is true. But also there's different types of horror movies. It doesn't just have to be jump scares, as Humam already tells you. It can be psychological thrillers that also have horror elements to it. And then they say there's like a reluctancy to make it. Again, I don't think this is true because this is simply more profitable. I think they give you this very weird assertion, which is like horror is expensive to make because like there's other story plots that you need to talk about in horror movies. I think this is just empirically not true. The Blair Witch Project netted over $100 million in the box office at the cost of $100,000. I think this can empirically prove to you that horror itself can be extremely profitable. But then, like, I think we get this really weird characterization out of CO, which is like, why don't we blend other types of media with the racism plot? Like, add romance plus racism and then make a movie out of it. Like, I don't know. I don't think this fully meets the burden that off-bench has to prove, which is like, if you want a realistic portrayal, that probably has to be the center of your plot. I don't know if like mixing it with other type of genre, this fully meets the burden that they actually want. Lastly, they have this interesting idea that's basically like, look, you have to sit there and think about the metaphor if it is a horror movie rather than our side of the house. Like, honestly, I don't know if this is true. I think, when people watch a movie and you really like the movie, people have a tendency to want to go engage with content around the movie, right? So even if, like, I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit slow and I didn't catch the internal racial metaphor behind a movie, if I really enjoyed the movie and I really liked it, I'm likely to look it up online, then I'm going to find interpretations of the movie, people dissecting the movie and telling me the story and messaging behind it. I also think it's quite intuitive. Like I think most people can tell metaphors of hurt from just a realistic storyline. But also, I think this is actually like I want to flip this to opposition themselves, right? Because if the portrayal that they're standing for is like a realistic portrayal of racism in action in everyday life, oftentimes, and as Ola points out themselves, this is oftentimes mundane, right? It is about the microaggressions that you're likely to experience. I think these type of things require more thinking from someone who hasn't had those experiences. If I'm not a Black person, I probably have to sit there and think about how would I feel if I was in that type of situation. It probably requires more mental processing on their end. And I think the only individuals who are likely to engage with this are people who probably already care to some extent about the Black people's experiences. They're likely to do the work of sitting there being like, how would that make me feel? But I think if this is a group of people that they want to target, I think these types of people are likely to understand and get this type of content in other alternative ways. You can watch interviews where people can be very candid about their experiences with racism. There are other like more factual outlets than the entertainment industry to get this type of depiction, because I think fundamentally anything that is in entertainment, no matter how realistic opposition wants to claim, there will be a dramatic flair to it. Because in order to produce a movie in the first place, you have to have a plot, you have to have a climax that gets to the highlight of the story, and then it slowly comes down. Even O themselves concede we're gonna have a happy ending. Unfortunately, I don't think this is how real life works, right? You shouldn't, like, I don't know if you want people to leave the theaters with the feeling of, oh, such a happy ending, racism is solved, like when that's just not the reality in the status quo. So I think there are inherent natures about being an entertainment film that requires like producers to make certain edits to it. O's response to this is like, oh, we're gonna have minority directors who are gonna do this, and they're likely to do this in a good way. I think there's still a lot of external other pressures. Like if you want funding for your movie, you probably need this movie to be an interesting plot in which investors can believe that this is gonna do well in the box office to get those type of funding. So I think there's a lot of inherent, very restrictive aspects to trying to portray something very realistically in film, while we think there are much other better methods like going on the news or like being in a podcast where people can actually talk very candidly about their experiences with no filter at all. We think that's a much better way for people to get the realistic experience if they so seek this. All right, let's. I think a lot of that also deals with the OO case, but they basically just say like this is really important for validation. I think it's not that great for validation when you think you're telling a story, you take it to a producer, and they end up changing aspects of your story, and you feel like, wait, my story is actually not being depicted in the way that I wanted to. And also, I would just like to pause it. Reality probably feels different for every single individual. When you sell your film as a realistic depiction of racism, and minorities feel like, wait, that doesn't feel aligned with my story, right? People are likely to have backlash against these type of stories, and that is probably quite harmful opening.
Well, like the burden of proving white people don't watch these films is ludicrous. They are not antagonistic. They have complex characters and motivations, and they can be subtle. There are many types of films to suit different preferences.
Like, I still think the burden is unfortunately on opposition to prove to me why people are likely to opt into watching these in the first place. If you yourself admit, like, white people are often portrayed in a negative manner in these types of films, I don't think you guys are meeting the burden of proof why someone is likely to pay money out of their pocket to actually subscribe into this. Okay. Let's talk about then what Humam gives you and why we differentiate from our opening, right? I think A, we're actually able to way better prove the aspect of reach and why people are likely to be more interested in the story and therefore engage with the story on a greater level. I think we give you alternatives for the goals that opposition wants to reach, but I think the goal of entertainment and the unique aspect of it is it's able to grab people's attention, draw you in, and then we're able to teach you a message from it. I think OG centers their like case on like the enfranchisement of actors. They mention like novelty, but don't actually explain why novelty is specifically important to people consuming this type of content. We also engage more directly on why the quality of the story can improve, right? It is because you are able to have more creativity. It's unclear to me why, like, I don't know, like the only thing that like actors or producers care about is like telling a real story when these are inherent creative individuals who probably also care about the creative quality of their work. I also think like at the end of the day, what is the most important thing that we're able to give to you is we're able to better represent internal emotions of individuals. It's not just on the physicality of the experience, but the emotions that you actually feel. I think we're way better at depicting that on our side of the house. Very, very proud to propose.
Yeah, you can peel behind me like 7 times, just for fun. Okay.
Nobody changes.
I'm going to respond to CG way over a front half and then talk about OG. CG kind of says a few things. The first is that they tell us that like there are heavy restrictions on the ways in which you can portray things on our side of the house, i.e. that you're limited to specific instances of like telling the same story about slavery like 300 times in the past. I don't get why this is like the case. It's not entirely true that you have to like talk about slavery set in the time slavery happened. You can talk about the insane like power dynamics that still exist these days. You can still show the discrimination that happens in real life. That's not necessarily true. Even fucking Star Trek showed us like a gay couple in the time when homosexuality was still really bad. There are many mediums, and there have always been mediums for talking about important issues that you can incorporate them into the stories. The second thing that CG tells us is just that like like I guess government as a whole just assumes that people are going to understand the fear and like the metaphor and be able to kind of like extract the messaging that exists in the media that they can. The problem is that people genuinely cannot. They like what literally tells us that like, you know, yeah, you can always just like watch the interviews where people talk candidly about their experiences. The problem is people don't. Why would you spend time Googling like what a horror movie's metaphor is when you can just keep go like, you know, go watch fucking Fortnite highlight reels. You don't take the time to go and look at those interviews because you don't really care. You care about the fact that the monster was really, really cool. You care about the visual effects that went into it, but you don't care to the extent where like, you know, you think about the messaging that is because you're not like emotionally attached to the messaging. You are more emotionally attached to the fear that the monster made you feel. And like the fear is kind of the fear is what happens, and it does not translate well into the messaging. The problem is that these people also cannot draw the parallels in real life because they haven't had those experiences. You must show them a character that they can build an emotional attachment to, a protagonist that they can actively be invested in and root for, and then you show that protagonist facing injustice. When they personally relate to that protagonist and they can see themselves in the protagonist, the injustice and the discrimination that protagonist faces is more deeply and proximately felt upon them than a protagonist that is just running away from a monster because, oh no, I don't want to get killed, haha. Like, the messaging is so much better on our side of the house. They're far more likely to actually be able to internalize the messages on our side. The last thing that CG tells you, I'm not taking you guys, is that there are better budgets from Hollywood. This doesn't have to be the case because messaging doesn't have to be the central part of the movie. Everything Ever All at Once, Conclave, TV shows like Wednesday are all about discrimination against an entire group of people who do that messaging incredibly well. And when the movie isn't about horror, because you can integrate these kinds of messaging into many, many different storylines, right? And these things have been really, really acclaimed. The other thing is that like there are many bigger box office movies with fat marketing these days. Like, you know, I think we're all kind of woke. Society's pretty woke these days. They're very likely to be amenable to like a writer or an actor wanting to incorporate their lived experiences into some aspect of the movie. They're more likely to be able to do that on our side of the house when you don't have to invest more resources into making the monster look different or the visual effects look a certain way or changing how the monster attacks in order to show a specific aspect of the fear or the you know, that like represents discrimination. You can just directly show the discrimination on our side of the house. You don't have to do much more you know, than to change like one scene. So it's the barrier to like entry to like even kind of showing that scene as part of like another separate film is still a lot lower on our side of the house. I'm not taking CG. On to front half. I've kind of two things about front half. The first is that I think that they kind of have the similar problem as OG does, is in the fact that the margin of change on their side is kind of unclear. They claim that it is important that works that are like fundamental and representative communities exist, and that people get to interact with them. The thing is that these kinds of like media will exist in both forms on both sides of the house. It is just the question about which one we want more of and which one we want more than the other. The thing is that minority producers still make a lot of content about their stories, and there will always be producers who want to make the you know, films about their stories. There will be like, you know, trans people who make movies like I Saw the TV Globe because they want to talk about it. These things will symmetrically exist, and the catharsis inducing ones will still induce catharsis on the people who actively seek them out because they want to feel seen and heard, you know, because they have an incentive to kind of be like to feel seen and share that trauma with people, and they will spread in that community anyways. The moving the goalposts of horror-based violence also just doesn't happen if mainstream audiences doesn't see them. The prerequisite for their stuff kind of occurring is actually you know, like having people view the things. And I think at the point in which you know, like OO doesn't actually like prove that we get more like, you know, kind of mainstream acceptance, or why like we get more catharsis in a way that is uniquely meaningful, I don't think that margin really matters. The second thing is just that I don't think they actually tell us why having more works is important. It's kind of unclear how much more utility minorities get out of like, you know, 3 movies about racial discrimination versus 4 movies about racial discrimination because OO is specifically targeting those communities. Like, I guess the extension here is to show that our side's movies and content are better at reaching mainstream audiences who could be sympathetic but just do not really have the tools to understand. When we are able to reach those audiences and actually get to them in a way that like a government bench cannot, that is when they're more emotionally against injustice. That's when they're able to do things like talk to their friends, change their behavior in meaningful ways to make you know, like the minorities around them feel more seen and more like equals. I think this is probably more important when the people who have previously consumed 0 movies now are able to see 1 movie and actively think about it in a way that they otherwise could not have. Hamza?
Yeah, every movie you mentioned in your first speech was
Bro,
a horror
okay,
movie.
bro, you
Here.
oh my god, bro, you fucking DM me this on Discord. Yeah, the reason why I mentioned horror movies was to tell you why they don't fucking work. Like, hello? Like these so fucking free. I know we all have great media literacy, but these movies aren't like super goated or super big because of the fact that they're not just like mainstream appeal. Like whatever, bro. Yeah, okay, on you guys. Yeah, firstly, you guys also have a fucking skill issue with your metric on catharsis. This should already exist. I already said this in regards to like OO, so I don't know why on your side you guys get so much more catharsis to the point where we should care about that like marginal like returnative utility that we got on your side. The second thing is just that mainstream reach when people's rights are taken away is probably way more important. People who are not exposed to existing content are more important than you guys because you guys also are like, oh, like catharsis, guys, whatever. But the thing is, people get catharsis, so it's more important to sway people's opinions who are more open to being swayed or who don't already like feel very strongly about like minority treatment and to get them to sympathize with minorities. I don't think that on your side, even if people get more catharsis, the kind of like the forms of discrimination, how much discrimination they like experience in their day-to-day lives don't change because the people who are doing those microaggressions, who misspell my fucking name in a work email like 3 times in a row, they're not the ones who like give a fuck because they don't see this content and they don't know why it matters to us. The last thing that OG says is just that like it's like accessible. I low-key should have written down your mechanisms. I thought they were kind of goofy though. But I think I gave you a bunch of mechanisms about why it is actually not accessible. If you do not pick the movie because you're not interested in horror, if you do not realize what the messaging is, or if you just scroll past that content every single time, you're never going to get there. Nothing is ever going to change. I think your side has a problem with the amount of content that is being produced, the accessibility of that content, and how people react to it. We oppose.
Brilliant. Thank the speaker for the remarks.